The late afternoon sun poured through the grand bay windows of the Grant estate, casting long shadows across marble floors and antique furniture. The house, a sprawling mansion perched atop Crest Hill Ridge, had always been a symbol of power, precision, and wealth. Everything inside, down to the golden-framed paintings and imported sculptures, whispered, legacy. But today, the house felt different. Heavy, quiet, as if it knew that something was about to change. Edward Grant stood by the fireplace, his sharp suit perfectly pressed as always, yet his eyes carried a weariness he didn't bother to hide. A man once hailed as one of the top CEOs in the country, Edward had built his company from the ground up, turning a modest logistics firm into a global empire over the course of 3 decades. Across the room sat his 3 children, Andrew, Claire, and Ryan. Andrew, the eldest, lounged with a scotch in hand, exuding the careless arrogance of someone who never had to earn anything. Claire, elegant and sharp-tongued, tapped away on her phone, only half interested in what her father had summoned them for. And Ryan, the youngest, sat upright, attentive but quiet, his hands folded in his lap. Edward took a breath. "I've called you here today because there's something you need to know," he began, his voice steady but low. Andrew rolled his eyes. "Let me guess. You're finally stepping down?" "No," Edward replied. "It's more serious than that." Claire looked up from her phone. "More serious than retirement?" Edward nodded. "I've lost everything." Silence. "I'm sorry?" Claire blinked. "I said," Edward repeated, "I've lost everything. The company is bankrupt. We've been under investigation for months. The board pulled out last week. Creditors froze the accounts. All our assets are gone. Cars, properties, investments, including this house. We have 30 days. Andrew sat up straight now, scotch forgotten in his hand. "You're joking." Edward shook his head. "This estate will be repossessed. We'll have to move." Claire stood abruptly. "How the hell did you let this happen? You're supposed to be the brilliant mind behind all of it." "I made mistakes," Edward said quietly. "I trusted the wrong people, and maybe I held on too long." Andrew scoffed. "So what, now you want us to pick up your mess?" Claire grabbed her purse. "I didn't go to business school and spend years building my career to play nursemaid to your downfall." Edward didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for your help." "Good," Claire snapped, "because I'm not offering it." She turned and walked out of the room without another word. Andrew lingered. "You know, if you'd handed the company to me 5 years ago like I asked, maybe this wouldn't have happened." Edward looked at him with tired eyes. "Maybe." Andrew stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and followed Claire's path out. Now only Ryan remained. He hadn't said a word since the announcement. His face was unreadable, not shocked, not angry, just still. Edward turned to him. "I don't expect anything from you either, son. You have your whole life ahead. Go live it." Ryan didn't move. Instead, he asked softly, "Have you eaten anything today?" Edward blinked. "What?" "Lunch. Dinner. Have you eaten?" A pause. Then Edward shook his head. "I suppose I haven't." Ryan stood up and headed toward the kitchen. "I'll make something." Edward opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, he just watched his youngest son disappear around the corner. A warmth, long buried under years of corporate meetings and cold numbers, flickered in his chest. He sat down slowly, exhaled, and whispered to himself, "Maybe I haven't lost everything after all." The moving truck pulled away from the curb with a low groan, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and the faded echo of its engine. What remained was silence, and a two-bedroom, paint-chipped house nestled at the edge of a quiet, working-class neighborhood. Edward Grant stood motionless on the cracked sidewalk, gazing at the small house. It was a far cry from the marble floors and crystal chandeliers of Crest Hill Ridge. The yard was overgrown. The shutters hung slightly crooked. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped onto it. Ryan was already inside, unpacking 2 suitcases. That was all they had now. 2 suitcases and whatever the moving crew hadn't deemed too luxury to downsize. For the first time in his adult life, Edward Grant didn't have a driver, didn't have a maid, didn't even have someone to bring him coffee in the morning. Just silence. And Ryan. The first few days passed quietly, awkwardly. Edward tried to keep his pride intact, but the new reality crept in fast. The hot water was unreliable. The heater made strange noises at night. And instead of having a private chef prepare his meals, he watched his son Google how to make simple pasta with 3 ingredients. Ryan, meanwhile, adjusted faster. He bought second-hand furniture, stocked the fridge with discount groceries, and printed out job listings from the local library. "Why are you doing all this?" Edward asked one morning, watching Ryan sweep the front porch. Ryan shrugged. "Because we still need to live, Dad." Edward said nothing, just nodded. But not all adjustments were as smooth. Andrew and Claire had stopped answering calls, not even a text. The silence from his other children was louder than any fight could have been. And it hurt. 1 week in, Ryan quit his part-time internship at a local architecture firm, one he'd worked hard to land just 2 months prior. "You didn't have to do that," Edward said. "You should have kept it." "We need the money," Ryan replied. "I can find work that pays faster." The next day, Ryan came home in a reflective vest and grease-stained jeans. "Delivery driver," he explained, tossing a crumpled receipt on the table. "It's not forever, just enough to keep us afloat." Edward couldn't look at him. Shame clung to him like dust. That night, he sat alone in the dark living room, the glow of a street lamp casting long shadows across the bare walls. On the table in front of him was an untouched bowl of soup Ryan had made before heading to his shift. He looked down at his own hands. Hands that once signed million-dollar contracts, now trembling over a bowl of soup made by his last remaining child. He whispered to himself, "What have I done?" The weather began to shift as fall turned to winter. One night, during a heavy downpour, Edward sat near the window and watched Ryan pull into the driveway on a battered old scooter. Ryan parked, removed his helmet, and noticed something wrong with the engine. Without hesitation, despite the rain, he knelt down beside the scooter and began working with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. Edward rushed to the door. "Ryan, get inside, it's freezing out here." Ryan didn't look up. "If I don't fix it, I can't work tomorrow. Let me help." "No offense, Dad," Ryan grunted, "but unless you can hold a flashlight and forget you used to have 6 chauffeurs, stay warm and dry." Edward stood there, helpless, heart aching. He had never felt smaller. The next morning, before Ryan woke up, Edward slipped a note under his bedroom door. It read, "You shouldn't have to be the one carrying me. I'm sorry." When Ryan read it, he said nothing. Just folded the note, put it in his wallet, and kept it there. Weeks turned into a month. The house, though modest, became a place of routine. Ryan worked long shifts. Edward began cooking small meals, watching YouTube videos on how to budget, even sweeping the porch himself. He started to understand what it meant to struggle, not because he had to, but because someone he loved did it without complaint. And every night, when Ryan came home, they sat together in the living room, ate simple meals, and talked. Really talked. Not about money, not about careers, but about life. The irony wasn't lost on Edward. In losing everything, he had finally begun to gain something he never realized he was missing. His son. The cold of winter deepened. The little house on Eastbrook Lane now wore a coat of frost each morning, the windows fogging over as soon as the heater sputtered to life. Ryan had taken to leaving the house before sunrise and returning well after sunset, his delivery shifts growing longer with each passing day. Edward watched him quietly, guilt gnawing at his insides. The boy had given up everything, his internship, his youth, his comfort, without asking for anything in return. But Edward, ever the strategist, knew one thing. Character is best revealed when pushed to the brink. And so, the final test began. One morning, Edward feigned a collapse in the kitchen. He'd made sure to stage it carefully. A spilled cup of water, a twisted expression, a trembling hand. When Ryan returned from his morning run and found him on the floor, he dropped everything. "Dad? Dad, talk to me." Edward didn't respond. Ryan called an ambulance immediately, but Edward had already arranged things behind the scenes. The EMTs were actors, trusted friends from the past. The hospital they rushed him to was real, but the diagnosis wasn't. His personal physician, Dr. Whitmore, had been brought into the plan weeks earlier. At the hospital, Ryan paced in the waiting room, eyes sunken from exhaustion and worry. Dr. Whitmore emerged an hour later. "Your father's had a minor stroke," he said grimly. "His motor functions are stable, but he may lose speech temporarily. He'll need medication, constant care, and rest." Ryan didn't flinch. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. "He's conscious, but don't expect conversation." Edward lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to a saline drip, pretending to be weaker than he felt. His mouth twitched subtly. He made eye contact with Ryan, blinked slowly, but said nothing. Ryan sat beside him. "I'll take care of you," he said softly. "Don't worry. We'll get through this." He meant every word. In the following days, Ryan became nurse, cook, and caretaker all in one. He bathed his father, changed his clothes, cooked soft foods, administered medication. He even borrowed money from a friend to buy the pills the hospital didn't cover. And he never complained. Not once. One evening, after putting Edward to bed, Ryan sat at the kitchen table and stared at his phone. His bank account was nearly empty. He had just enough left for groceries or rent. He chose groceries. He sold his old laptop the next morning and used the cash to buy more medication. "We'll figure rent out later," he told himself. Dr. Whitmore kept Edward updated in secret. "He sold his laptop yesterday," the doctor said quietly during a phone call. "He's exhausted, Ed, but he won't quit." Edward, listening on speakerphone from the back of the car, closed his eyes. "How much more can I put him through?" "You asked me to be honest," Dr. Whitmore replied. "He passed the test 2 weeks ago." Edward nodded. "I'll end it tomorrow." The next evening, Ryan was cooking lentil soup when Edward walked out of his bedroom, unassisted. No cane, no limp, no confusion. Ryan turned, ladle in hand, eyes wide. "Dad?" Edward smiled. "I think I can talk again." Ryan blinked. What? "I feel great, actually." He stepped forward and sat down at the table like nothing had ever happened. Ryan stared at him. What's going on?" Edward folded his hands. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." And so, Edward laid it all out. The fake bankruptcy, the hidden wealth, the false diagnosis, the hired EMTs, everything. By the end, Ryan was too stunned to speak. Edward looked him in the eye, voice calm but thick with emotion. I had to know. Had to know if it was love, or loyalty to money, if it was real. Ryan swallowed hard. You lied to me. I did. You made me think I was going to lose you. I know. And for that, I'm sorry. But I needed to see who would still be here when the world disappeared. Ryan stood, pacing the room. And what now? He asked bitterly. Do I get a prize? Edward got up slowly, walked over, and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. No, he said. You get the truth. There was a long silence, and then Edward added, and tomorrow, you're coming with me, to the office, because the company I lost still exists, and it needs a new heir. Ryan stared at him, stunned. Edward smiled. You earned more than my money, Ryan. You earned my trust. The lobby of Grant International buzzed with anticipation. It had been months since Edward Grant was seen at headquarters. Rumors swirled. Everything from a silent takeover to illness to scandal. No one knew the truth. And when the invitation went out for a private executive celebration, it only deepened the mystery. Now, employees gathered in the main event hall on the 35th floor. It was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. A stage had been set up at the front, adorned with the company's crest in gold. Rows of chairs were filled with department heads, investors, and longtime staff. At exactly 5 p.m., the double doors opened. Edward Grant stepped in. He was in full stride, suit sharp, posture tall, not a man broken by failure, but one reborn with clarity. And by his side, walking with quiet confidence, was Ryan. The room fell into a hush. The whispers began instantly. Is that, his youngest son? Didn't he leave the company years ago? Wait, I thought Edward lost everything. Edward took the stage and stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. Good evening, he began, voice calm and composed. Some of you look surprised to see me. Some of you, relieved. A few nervous laughs rippled across the audience. He continued. Over the past few months, I've stepped away. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. I needed to see something more clearly than board reports and profit charts could show me. He paused, scanning the room. I pretended to lose everything. Now the room went still. I told the world I had gone bankrupt. I allowed the story to spread. I disappeared. I let my children believe we were ruined. Gasps erupted. Murmurs spread like wildfire. In doing so, I watched the people closest to me make a choice. Stay or leave. Love or convenience. Loyalty or comfort. He turned slightly and gestured toward Ryan, who stood at the edge of the stage. This young man, Edward said, gave up his comfort, his time, his youth, not because I asked, but because he has something this company has always been built on: integrity. A long beat of silence. Edward then looked to the back of the room. Two new figures had just entered, Andrew and Claire. Late. Claire wore a forced smile. Andrew looked more annoyed than apologetic. They made their way forward as discreetly as possible, but all eyes were on them. Edward didn't skip a beat. My eldest children, he said, tone firm but not cruel. They were given the same test, and they chose to walk away. I don't hold hatred in my heart, but I do remember. Andrew's face reddened. Claire looked down at her shoes. Edward turned back to the crowd. I'm here tonight not to scold, but to announce. He stepped aside and placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. As of today, I am stepping down as CEO of Grant International. Gasps again. And appointing Ryan Grant as my successor, effective immediately. The audience erupted. Applause, disbelief, even a few cheers from long-standing staff who remembered Ryan as the quiet, humble son who never chased power. Claire stepped forward suddenly. "Dad, please," she said. "We didn't know. If we'd known it was a test." Edward turned to her calmly. "That was the point." Andrew followed. "This isn't fair. You can't just hand everything over based on some moral game." Edward raised an eyebrow. "You're right. I can't. But I can hand it over based on who showed up when no one else did." The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan, still stunned, turned toward his father. "Are you sure?" Edward nodded. "You didn't ask for this. That's exactly why you deserve it." He faced the room again. This company was built not just on strategy or ambition, but on values. And Ryan reminded me of those values when I had forgotten them myself. As the event closed, guests came forward to shake Ryan's hand, offer congratulations, and express genuine admiration. Andrew and Claire faded into the background, whispers following in their wake. For once, the spotlight wasn't on them. It never had been. Later that night, as father and son stood alone in Edward's former corner office, now Ryan's, they looked out at the city. "You sure you're ready for this?" Edward asked. Ryan smiled. "Number, but I'll figure it out. The same way I figured out how to stretch $50 for groceries." Edward laughed, truly, deeply laughed for the first time in years. And in that moment, wealth had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with who stood beside you when everything else was gone. The office had never felt so different. Where once the corner suite on the top floor of Grant International had been filled with dark wood furniture, polished marble, and an air of untouchable authority, it now felt lighter, fresher, more human. Ryan sat behind the executive desk, not with arrogance or entitlement, but with an air of quiet resolve. The view from the 40th floor stretched endlessly, the city lights twinkling like stars below. He looked down at the nameplate freshly placed at the edge of the table. Ryan Grant, Chief Executive Officer. It still didn't feel real. Behind him, the door creaked open gently. Edward entered, a cup of coffee in each hand. "Still think I'm crazy for doing this?" he asked, placing one mug on the desk. Ryan smiled. "I think you're a little dramatic, but no, not crazy." Edward sat across from him, the late evening sun casting a warm hue over his silver hair. "Back when I was your age," Edward said, "I thought legacy meant assets, buildings, profit margins. I was wrong." Ryan looked up. "What changed your mind?" Edward exhaled slowly. "Losing everything, or thinking I did. Watching you do more with less than I ever did with abundance. It made me realize. Legacy isn't what you leave in a vault. It's what you leave in someone's character." The room fell quiet for a while. Outside, traffic buzzed, a siren in the distance, the city moving on, unaware that a dynasty had just been passed on, not by bloodline, but by principle. "I never asked for this," Ryan said quietly. "I know," Edward replied. "That's why you're the only one I could trust with it." Weeks passed. Ryan took to his new role with humility and focus. He didn't make sweeping changes, but subtle ones. Shifts in policy that prioritized employees, new initiatives for community outreach, and a company-wide culture day that included everyone from senior VPs to janitors. People noticed. The press began referring to Grant International as the company that remembered its soul. Employees felt it too. The walls once filled with tension and competition now pulsed with energy and unity. And through it all, Edward watched from the sidelines, no longer the captain of the ship, but its proudest passenger. One morning, Ryan was asked to deliver his first keynote speech at a business leadership summit. The event was televised nationally, drawing an audience of over 2 million. He stepped onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at a sea of faces. "My name is Ryan Grant," he began, "and I wasn't born to lead a company. In fact, I wasn't supposed to be standing here at all. I was the youngest, the quiet one, the one no one bet on." The audience chuckled lightly. "But life," he continued, "has a funny way of showing you who you really are. Not when you're surrounded by comfort, but when everything is taken away. When you have to choose between pride and people." He paused. "A few months ago, I thought I had lost everything. But what I gained in that little house on East Brook Lane, caring for a man who I thought had lost his fortune, turned out to be the greatest inheritance I could have asked for." He looked directly into the camera. "Success isn't measured by how high you build your walls. It's measured by how deeply you care for those who sit inside them with you." The room erupted in applause. Back at home, Edward sat on the old worn-down couch from their time in the modest house, now kept as a reminder in his private study. He watched the speech on a small screen, eyes glassy. When Ryan spoke those words, "Success is measured by how deeply you care," Edward wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. He had built an empire, but his son had given it meaning. That night, Ryan returned home late, loosened his tie, and found Edward waiting at the kitchen table. "You watched it?" Ryan asked. Edward nodded. "You proud?" "I'm grateful," Edward replied, "that you forgave me, that you stayed, that you became better than I ever was." Ryan sat down, the room quiet around them. "You know," he said with a small laugh, "that first night, when you said we'd lost everything, I wasn't thinking about the money." Edward raised an eyebrow. "I was thinking about you." The two men sat there for a long time, sharing silence not of absence, but of peace.